All right. So happy to answer any questions you might have. Looks like there's just a few of you. So yeah, go ahead. Anybody you can either put your questions in the chat, or you can turn on your mic and ask away. I'll pull up the slides if I think they'll help.
I actually had a question.
Great.
Start off. Do you mind going over the last slides we went over yesterday? For example, the main slide, the cross-modal speaker information.
Yeah, I went over those very quickly, obviously.
Yeah,
and so
I just want to make sure I got everything.
Yeah, I'm not going to be asking a lot of questions off of those.
Okay. Okay.
I can pull them up still. Hold on just a second. Just take a second here. All right. Okay. Oops. Right. Let me just look over the slides and see if there is anything. Yeah, what is important, let's see. Hold on a second. This is not the full slides. Sorry about this, just take a second. Sorry. I've got to find the slide. I don't know why it's not popping up. Okay, so for example, I do not discuss anything about prosopagnosia. I realized I went through that too fast. So let me go ahead and just share my screen here. So unfortunately, I'm not gonna, sorry. Yeah, that's what happens to you all. I'm not gonna have time. I didn't have time to go through this in any detail, so I didn't put this on the test. But this is really kind of a slide that discusses some more recent research on prosopagnosia that suggests that for the most part, it looks like prosopagnosics who say they can't recognize faces, who have the experience of not recognizing faces, actually at an unconscious level do recognize faces. That's kind of the point of this slide, that you can use kind of more covert measures such as sweat and kind of eye scanning and also response time, and find that even though prosopagnosia is just saying, I have no idea who that is, I have no idea if the face matches the name I'm seeing, in a way they do. And that was kind of a way for us to understand that even if there sometimes does seem to be very clear evidence for an anatomical specialization, sometimes that evidence turns out to be questionable because new findings have arisen. So that was one of the reasons I talked about that. And then at the very end, I talked about functional specialization in face perception, and I talked about the fact that it really might have more to do with the fact that we have a kind of expertise in face perception. We're all terrific at recognizing faces very, very quickly, and that if one establishes an expertise with another class of stimuli, for example, dogs, or what else have they tested? Architects and houses, people who've really spent a good amount of time learning to make fine discriminations between items in a category of stimuli, then in fact, you do find that they show the same sorts of face specialized sorts of effects that the rest of us do for faces. And you can even learn a set of stimuli within the course of a few hours called greebles, and then start showing inversion effects and different sorts of featural effects, which I didn't have a chance to go over. And then finally, I talked about speech perception and some of the phenomena. Don't worry about this, just some of the phenomena that we were talking about is potentially specialized to speech, including categorical perception and McGurk effects, do, as it turns out, more recently, we've learned that they can apply to other stimuli as well. So I just concluded then saying that that when it comes to faces in speech, in some ways they might seem to be specialized, but then if you start looking kind of more carefully at different types of things, such as expertise, different sorts of ways that people might be able to show that they don't have a complete deficit from some sort of brain lesion or something like that, it becomes a little bit more questionable. So this was kind of a way of saying that not everybody is settled on the idea that we have specialized modules for different functions. There's folks that really wonder how true that is if you kind of look at different sorts of evidence. Okay, so that gives you a general idea. None of this will be on the test. So it's probably much more than you needed to know. Okay, okay, other questions? Somebody put something in chat. Oh, formants. Absolutely, Rachel. Be happy to talk about formants. Let me go ahead and pull that up. Oops. I have to move a couple of windows over, sorry. All right. Formants are just really a technical term for the potential cues for speech perception, for heard speech perception. So, I put this old slide up, or this old image here. We all remember this from earlier in the quarter, where we were trying to identify the features for letters, right? So we could get our check reading machine or our zip code reading machine in the post office to be able to recognize letters, and potentially this might be the way the brain does it too. So the idea is that through this feature analysis, looking for features of the letters and kind of trying to determine how these features are kind of combined, and then making a decision, we can arrive at the solution. So if we were to do the same thing, and a computationalist might do this, a connectionist might do this, if you're interested, you would have to find this in sound when it came to the sounds of speech. And so what I suggested is that formants might be the type of thing you would look for. And formants are these kind of dense bands of energy you see in this speech spectrogram. So that's what this is just called, a speech spectrogram. It just shows the sounds of speech. These are syllables, ah, pa, ah, ba, and this is time then along the x-axis, and here's frequency if you're interested, and then how intense, how much energy there is in the sound at these frequencies as they unravel across time is noted by how dark these little bars are. And when you start seeing kind of patterns of darkness here, these are called formants. And so potentially, if these are the features of speech, you could teach the speech recognition device, or the brain could look for these formants and their shape. And so, as you can see, there's a little ramp at the beginning of this formant. I am assuming you're seeing my cursor here. I actually haven't put a slideshow in, but I'm assuming you still see it. This is showing a formant here, but it has a little downward slope, and that's called just a formant transition. When there's a slope in the beginning, it's called a transition. And potentially, on a first pass, that might distinguish like a da sound from a ga sound and a ba sound. However, what we discussed is the fact that once you put these formants and the formant transitions into other vowel contexts besides ah, maybe you use an E set vowel or something like that, the critical formant cues start to change. So while what distinguishes da from ba here, this is good. This is you can see there's a downward slope here. And kind of, it's hard to see here, but there's an upward slope here for a ba. It's kind of difficult to see, but hopefully you can see some little shape there. That might be the critical formant transition cue, so we could get our speech recognizing computer to do that and recognize da and ba in that context. But then when you put another vowel in, or put another vowel in the front, or even, this goes beyond what you need to know, but two vowels further up can have an effect on this as well, as can other consonants. You lose these critical cues. You lose these critical features. And that's why it's been so hard to design a speech recognition device, a device that can recognize the sounds of speech versus the letters of language. So that's kind of the point of formants. It's a, it's a kind of a technical term for these kind of intense bands of energy, but potentially they would be something you would want a computer to potentially use for, features. However, it ain't that easy when it comes to the sounds of speech. Does that help, Rachel? Good. More chat questions. I see. Okay. What was the answer of the influence of lip reading question? Okay, Rachel, I'm going to come back to that because there are a couple of more. Oh, the slides are not showing at all? I'm so sorry. Is that right? Oh, somebody should have said something. Sorry. Melinda can see the formant slide?
Hi. Yes, I couldn't see the formal slide.
Is anybody seeing the slides?
No, the slide is just the how special our faces in speech, like the last one that we went over.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I guess what I have to do is whenever I change a slide, I have to stop the share. I'm so sorry. So don't be afraid to chime in if I'm talking about a slide that's not there. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's do this again. What I was pointing to when it came to the, so now you're seeing it, I assume. Yes, everyone's seeing it. Good. Okay, this is what I was pointing to. This is a formant right here, and you can see my cursor, I'm assuming too. And this is a downward little slope into the formant. That's a formant transition. This is the upward slope. And potentially these would be the things that our computer might look for when it came to looking for the features for the sounds of speech. But it only works up to a point, because once you change the context that that consonant is in, it's got to look for a whole new set of features, and that makes it really, really difficult. Okay, good. Glad you can see the slides now. Rachel asked, what was the answer to the influence of the lip reading question from class the other day? So this was one of the practice questions, Rachel? I don't remember if it was a practice question or not. Was it? Okay, new message. Yes. Okay, well, let me go ahead and look at it. What the heck? Oh my gosh. Okay, because I'm not. Okay, give me a second here. I am not using the same address as we use in the class, so I can't see my questions. Just give me a second. I am going to pull up the questions from, yeah, okay. So the question is, I'll just have to read it. I'm not going to be able to show it to you. Sorry, folks. The question is, which of the following factors has been shown to influence lip reading? A, the inversion of the face. B, applying the Margaret Thatcher manipulation to the face. C, familiarity with the speaker. Or D, all of the above. And the correct answer is all of the above, because inverting the face does influence lip reading. Okay, we did talk about the fact that it does decrease the McGurk effect a little bit, but it makes it harder to lip read when you invert a face. It's maybe not that surprising. I think what's more interesting, though, is it's not just inverting the face, it's inverting the face or inverting the mouth in the context of an upright face. So the Margaret Thatcher completely, really disrupts the McGurk effect, much more so than just seeing an inverted face, which also has the inverted mouth, suggesting that the context of the face has an influence over lip reading in the same way it did over face perception, which you think might not, as long as you're seeing the lips move, it shouldn't make much of a difference. But when you see the context of the face there, wow, it looks like there's also the sort of Thatcher effect you get, suggesting that maybe, there's a shared processing going on and the modules may not be as separate as we thought. And then finally, we talked a little bit about the fact that familiarity with the speaker. If you recognize the person's face, then it is easier to lip read from them, which also could suggest that there's an overlap in the functions for face recognition and lip reading. So the correct answer is all three of those are correct: inversion of the face, applying the Margaret Thatcher, manipulation to the face, and familiarity with the speaker. So the correct answer to that question is D, all of the above. Okay, cool. All right, let's go back. Any other chat questions? No, I think I've got these. Good. Okay, cool. What other questions do folks have? Other questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Thank you.
It's if it's possible to go over a little bit over the McGurk effect.
McGurk effect, sure. That's easy for me. Okay, let's go. So first, let me set it up for you. And then we will. Okay, share your slide. So I assume you know what the McGurk effect is, because we did show it in class, and if you missed the class, it should have been you should see in the video. But it is the situation where you're kind of bringing together a discrepant audio and video, where the audio is what the subject's getting to their ears is the syllable ba, ba, ba over and over again. The video, though, is something else. It's synchronized with the ba, 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 but you're seeing the face produce a va, and a ga. And what's really interesting about this effect is that subjects perceive, and more than perceive, they believe they are hearing the syllables that are influenced by what they are seeing. So if you get a video tha and an audio ba, many people, if not most of them, will perceive it as tha. And I'll tell you from the one that we study in our lab, if you get an audio ba and a visual va, about 98% of native English speakers will say that's a va. But it's not. What their ears are getting are a ba. And again, it's an experience of hearing. That people will say, yes, I'm definitely hearing that as a va. Not just seeing something and hearing something different, I'm hearing it as a va. And then there's this other case, which is interesting too, where if your ears are getting a ba and your eyes are getting a da, what people end up reporting hearing is something in between. It's a da. So sometimes there's a kind of a visual dominance, and sometimes there's kind of a compromise between what the eyes and the ears are getting. Okay, so that's the McGurk effect. But then we went on to say that it's shown that a lot of really interesting things, right? So one of the first things, one of the most important things, I think, is the fact that the part of your brain that we typically considered to be responsible for hearing, your auditory cortex, is actually changed by what you're seeing. And if you're interested, this is actually the first example that scientists were able to show that the parts of the brain that we thought were just responsible for individual senses are actually influenced across the senses. So it's kind of an important finding in that sense. It seems to work with people from all language backgrounds. The combination of syllables might change from one language to another, but at least some form of the McGurk effect does work across languages. It works with 5-month-old infants, and I talked a little bit about the habituation methodology we use for that. And then it's such a strong effect, you don't even need to know that you're looking at a face in order for the effect to occur. And we talked a little bit about how that happens through this point light methodology. And I also talked about its strength in the context where I've seen this demonstration for probably 35 years now. I've seen this demonstration, and it still works on me. I know how it works. I've made the stimuli, I've been the face in the stimuli, it's been my voice, and it still absolutely works for me. It's suggesting it's kind of like one of these kind of cognitively impenetrable, no matter what I know about the effect, I can't kind of, stop the effect from happening. Just remember that cognitive impenetrability right there. And then we talked about Tadoma a little bit, and that is the technique that is used by deaf-blind people to perceive speech. That they will do is they'll touch a face, and they're able to learn to perceive speech that way pretty well. But even if you haven't learned the technique formally, if you haven't practiced the technique, and you come in as a hearing sighted person, You can be blindfolded and then given headphones to wear. And as you touch a face, possibly for the first time in your life, you're touching a face for purposes of speech perception, what you feel will influence what you hear through the headphones, suggesting that the McGurk effect not only works with sight and sound, it works with touch and sound, which is pretty cool, because again, this is a situation where you've probably never have perceived speech in this manner before, but it immediately, your brain says, oh, more speech information. I'm going to integrate that in, as best I can to get to incorporate whatever speech information is out there, even if I've never gotten it this way before. Okay, which is a pretty a cool sort of idea. Okay, does that help, Melinda?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you.
A couple more chat questions down here. Okay. Halida asks, what lecture would you recommend we start from? So I believe we started right after the test talking about distance perception and depth perception, and we spent a good amount of time during that lecture talking about how infants perceive depth and what the difference might be between the cues for depth and the information for depth. I would start there. Okay. Okay, yes, and then Carla asks that question specifically. Could you go over the relative importance of cues and information? So let me do that. Okay. So it'll take just a second for me to set up here. Okay. All right. Distance. Okay. Here it comes. Okay. So there's a lot on this. I wouldn't worry too much, but here, let me set this up. We discussed the idea. Shoot. Sorry, just give me a second here. Sorry, I'm having a little problem here with the sharing. Wow, that is really weird. Okay, sorry everybody. It's just going to take a second for me to reload this. There we go. Okay. Okay, so when we were talking about distance perception, what we tried to do, oops, sorry, hopefully everyone can see that, and if you can't, speak up, please. We started talking about the issues of distance perception kind of by carrying over some of the concepts we had talked about when we were discussing different theories of perception. And what we said is that kind of you can break down the types of input the brain might use for distance perception into two categories. One would be a category of sort of hints, suggestions about how the distance of the world is laid out, where there would need to be some embellishment, there would need to be some enhancement, there would need to be some interpretation. We said in a way that's kind of consistent with the computationalist or constructivist sort of approach to the information kind of being hints, and the brain had to do a lot of elaboration through the inference processes and all that sort of thing. Yeah, someone saying something? Okay, good. But there could be other types of input that could be useful too. And we talked about that as potentially being, I'm just going to go through this quickly, where there's a type of input that is more than just hints and suggestions and cues that then need to be interpreted. There could be very kind of dependable, rich information that is lawfully tied to, distance, how the objects in the world are laid out in front of you. That is so dependable. It doesn't really need to be reinterpreted. It doesn't need to be disambiguated. And that's kind of the idea that Gibson was suggesting, that that's what the brain evolved to use, those very, very trustworthy sorts of informational dimensions of the input. And so we said, okay, let's look at the different things that scientists have identified it as the type of input that we might use and see what's primary, what's more important, okay? And so we went ahead and talked about the information as being fully informative, again, not something that's just a hint or a suggestion, fully specific to things like the distance of different objects and stuff like that. Not simulative, and this should go back to the first half of the course. And again, we're not going to be going back to the first half of the course in the test beyond this. But remember what the simulative assumption is, that there's a simulation of the stimulus involves a simulation of the things that are going to be perceived in one form or another. But we talked about that from this perspective, the input is not simulative at all. We talked about, remember in the first half of the course, we talked about how there's very good, reliable, dependable information for this dimension right here, even though there's no kind of simulation. We're not getting light reflected from the surface up to the eye. So that's how we thought about simulative versus specificational information, and that it requires no elaboration. So I've said all these things already. And we said that this is more consistent with what Gibson kind of thought was the important input. So then what we did is we evaluated all the different types of input that scientists talk about that is used for depth perception, for distance perception, and then tried to find what the brain is kind of most dependent on. Is it the cues, or is it the informational sorts of dimensions? And we not only asked a question about what the brain might be most dependent on for adults, we also said, okay, so when we're born, it seems that, there's some controversy around this, but for our class, we'll say that when we're born, we seem to have some perception of depth, even if it's not, that great because of the focus of our eyes. We talked about the cliff experiments and with the glass and everything. So assuming that at least at a very young age that we are able to perceive distance and depth perception, are we more reliant on things that are very dependable, even if they seem kind of more complex in their input, or things that are simple in their input, but are less dependable? And that's how we kind of went through and discussed things like motion parallax and binocular disparity and relative size cues and all those things, and evaluated it based on these two kind of categories of input for depth perception. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Good, so that's for Carla. Yeah, does that answer your question, Carla? Is that good?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Great. All right. So let's go back here, and what other questions? Right, no problem, Cyrus. If you have to leave early, it's no problem. This is all going to be recorded. Even if you folks run out of questions and everyone leaves, you can just have an hour recording of me just looking at the camera. Okay, so what other questions do first? Lots of good dog pictures here, by the way.
Do you mind going over the binocular disparity?
Say that binocular disparity?
Binocular, sorry, yes.
Okay, sure. Actually, that's good because that slides up. So let's share our screen again. Yes, I'm gonna have to scroll through these slides a lot. These are all the cues we talked about. then we start talking about things that might be more portrayed as information. But here's, oh, that's binocular convergence. That's something a little different. Do know this, by the way, folks. We did talk about this a few times, that there's kinesthetic information that's actually available when we focus on things. And we talked about that as information for, kind of where the body is at any one time, including the lens of the eye, that when you, well, let's talk about binocular convergence. When you're looking at something that's getting closer to you, you know how when you're a kid, you kind of make yourself cross-eyed that way for fun. But that's what your eyes do when you pull something closer, and something's coming closer, our eyes do converge a little bit, and then they diverge when we're looking at something further away. It's kind of a reflex that allows us to keep focus on things. But interestingly, when we do that, what we're doing, that reflex kind of pulls our eyes, and that pulling of our eyes pulls the muscles around our eyes. And that we have little sensors in the muscles and the tendons in the eyes that tell our brain, oh, the eyes are converging, therefore we must be looking at something closer. So it is considered kind of visual information in the sense that, it has to do with the focus of our eyes. It has to do, with what our eyes are reflexively doing, but it also has to do with, what the brain knows about the position of different body parts, including the eyes, because of the pulling on the muscles and the pulling on the tendons. So that's what kinesthetic has to do with. Make sure you know that for the test. Okay. Binocular disparity. Okay, it's a very simple idea, just suggesting that as we look at things in the world, they hit each of our eyes in a little bit of a different way. It seems that there are regions of the brain that are sensitive to those differences in the image to the two eyes. In fact, as a kind of a bonus, there are folks that believe that that is a modular sort of function, the binocular disparity function, but that's another story. But the idea is, yeah, you just look at, like, you're looking at two things. Let's imagine there's a big post A out in front of you and a big post B out in front of you. And now you're looking down on somebody's head and looking at their eyes, and you see that the image that B makes and A makes on the left eye is a little different from the image A makes and B makes on the right eye. And the brain seems to detect the differences. That's what this is showing. It's a disparity. That's another word for difference here. And it has to do with two eyes. That's what makes it binocular. And this is just a way of representing the difference. Okay. And your brain does seem to be sensitive to that. It's called binocular disparity, or sometimes stereopsis. And then we talked about, in a way to think about that is, that having multiple points of observation as you're moving through the world, just say with a single eye, say you're a pirate, you're sailing through, a port or something like that. You only have a single eye. Something about the distance of things because of their, kind of shearing across your one good eye. So in a way, you're seeing depth with having multiple perspectives over time. And this is a way of thinking, in a way of binocular disparity too. You're kind of getting two positions at one time, and your brain's making use of that. So if you're not a pirate and you have both your eyes working, that's a way you can do that. So it is like motion parallax in that sense. And what I argued is that I think this is better portrayed as information because it, as long as you do have two eyes, and most of us do, that it is something that is always available to us. And then we talked about all the kind of interesting ways that you can kind of demonstrate this through stereoscopes and 3D movies and all this sort of stuff. So hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of what's meant by binocular disparity. Okay. All right, let me see. Looks like there's another question. Melinda had to leave early. Happy holidays, Melinda. No problem. All right, let's see. Other questions I can answer. Yes. Yuning asks for an explanation of cognitive impenetrability. Absolutely. I think it's probably good to bring that slide up. So let me stop the share and change the slide. Let's see, do I have our face slides up yet? No. Okay, let me pull the face slides up. Oops. So this is something that, hold on a second. This is something that was relevant both to face perception and speech perception. I'm having a little trouble here. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can fix this. Okay. Yeah, this is better. Okay. So this was relevant both to faces and speech perception, because we were considering it a characteristic of modules as we were talking, as we were introducing modules. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. Good. Okay. So the idea behind cognitive impenetrability is that the process of the module, in this case, the face module, would work even if we had, say, outside information that is contrary to it. Okay, so for example, maybe the most intuitive way of thinking of this and is with illusions, right? So, you know, I'm looking at this Mueller-Lyer illusion. And I see two arrows and two lines, and I'll tell you right now, this works great on me. This line here on the left seems longer to me than this line on the right. But then I could take out, I had a tape measure here somewhere because I carry one wherever I go. No, I could take out a tape measure and measure it on the screen and say, oh my gosh, they're different. I mean, they are actually the same size, those two lines that are in between their arrows. And then I'll put the tape measure down and I'll look at it again and say, but no, the illusion still works. So I have outside knowledge of the truth, right? That the lines are actually the same size. But boy, that process that involves, you know, the perceptual analysis of that illusion seems to not be penetrated by that outside knowledge, right? It's impenetrable by what I know outside, my cognition outside the process. That's what's meant by cognitive impenetrability. Now let's talk about faces, okay? We see faces in so many things, right? We see faces on, you know, mountainsides, in sandwiches, grilled cheese sandwiches, on the front of cars. You know, if you just do a search on the internet for faces, you know, in, you know, things that look like faces, you'll find trees that have like faces in their bark. You'll find Mars seems to have some sort of, you know, mountain landscape that looks like a face. It's you know, kind of a fun thing to do, but boy, you know, it's like you look at these things, oh yep, there's the face, there's the face, there's the face, even though we know that none of these things are faces, right? So we can't help but see faces in things that have some type of face information, even if consciously we know that's a front of a car, that's not a face, that's a cheese sandwich, that's not a face, that's a mountainside, that's not a face. We have all this, you know, kind of conscious, in these cases it's conscious, but you know, in other cases it could even be non-conscious information that doesn't penetrate the processing of the face, so we still see a face. And so that's what's meant by cognitive impenetrability. Okay, does that help? Who asked that question? Yuning, does that help? Okay, I assume it helps. Great. Other questions? Oh, yes. Can I go over ecological relevance? Yes, absolutely. Paulina. So that's up here right now, so we can just use it. Okay, so, you know, in retrospect, I think I probably should choose a different term, and I'll tell you why. It's the term that's used in the field, which is why I brought it in. But I really don't want people to get confused with how the term ecological is used here and the term ecological psychology or ecological, you know, perception or whatever, the ecological approach was used in the first half of the quarter. They're really not very related here, okay? So maybe next time I teach the course, I'll call it, you know, adaptive relevance or evolutionary relevance or something like that. Really, it just means that you wouldn't want a module for any little thing. You don't want a module for Coke cans or something like that. That would be ridiculous. You would, if there's going to be a part of the brain that's set aside for a function, you know, that's got to be an important thing, right? And so that's one of the things that would be a characteristic of a module, that it would be something that had some, evolutionary importance, some survival importance to us, right? You wouldn't want, I don't know, a module for faces that weren't human, for example, at least not right off the bat. And you wouldn't want a module for, I don't know, ferret faces, because, that would be a lot of brain real estate, and modules take up big chunks of the brain. So you would want it to have some adaptive, very obvious, very critical adaptive significance. And I think we have intuitions that, yeah, of course faces are important to us, and of course speech is important to us, but you would expect, if there is that importance, that you would see in development, boy, that is online very early. For example, it's available to infants very early, and it seems to be both faces and speech perceptions. These seem to be the sort of things that infants can, do as soon as they can be tested. And you want to see some cross-cultural sort of consistencies, right? Which you see in both cases. Every culture has a language. Every culture shows these kind of specialized face processes, suggesting that, yeah, these are critical functions to the survival of the species. And that's really what's meant by ecological relevance here. So I understand your question there. I wish I hadn't used the term ecological. It's just the term that's used in the literature, in the research field. So I borrowed it, but I can understand your confusion. Adaptive importance, evolutionary importance is really the better term. Okay. There was another question. Jessica asked, I'm not sure if you already reviewed this one, but can you go over how the slide? Oh, I think we skipped that, Jessica. I think we skipped it. Was that one of the slides in the slide pack that was posted, but I didn't cover? Possibly. Maybe people can remind me of that. That's a very good question, because I had it in my notes that we wondered why I didn't write anything. Okay, I think that's right, Jessica. I just went through that recorded lecture because I couldn't remember if I didn't do it or did do it in this class, because I did do it in another class very recently. I think in this class, I did not cover personality. I covered the closest we came, I think, when we discussed things like attractiveness and age and aspects like that when it came to looking at one side of the face. But I don't think I had time to, sadly, this quarter, I didn't have time to cover how people seem to be able to perceive personality from faces. And if anyone remembers otherwise, please let me know. If you're interested in that, Jessica, you can, I'm teaching Psych 49. I certainly go through it in Psych 49. It's also in a book I wrote, but other classes I'm sure teach it too. Well, do they? I would wonder if it's in a personality psychology course or social psychology. There's some really interesting research on that. So anyway, all right. Carla asked me to go through chimeric faces. Absolutely. Let me quickly change my slide again. Oh, yeah, it's right here. So what a chimeric face is. Yeah, here's the slides on personality. I see that. Okay. Yeah, let me just pull up this full slide so it'd be easy to talk about. Okay, let me go back here and I will share my screen. Yeah, there's Johnny Depp. Okay, terrific. Okay, so here's the idea. Really, I use the term chimeric faces because it was the technique. It's more of a kind of methodology in a way. I can't remember if it's on the test, so I might as well go ahead and teach it. But basically, it's a kind of a methodology where you can create different sides to a face image. And in this particular case, the left side of the face image was made based on one collection of faces, and the left side of the face, or the right side from our perspective, I'll call from here on in, I'll call this the left side. So the left side from our perspective, and this the right side, okay? Let me find a good one. I guess it's most obvious here. Yeah, if I asked you for expression, and those of you that are right-handed will hopefully have this experience at least. If I asked you which of these two people, the guy on top or the guy on bottom, was happier, you'd say, they don't look too different, but I'd say the guy on top is happier. Okay. All right. Why is that the case? Well, the first part is that you clearly know that this is a reversal. This is a reversal of this image, right? And the point of this whole slide was that the brain seems, of right-handed folks at least, seems to detect the left side of a face with more sensitivity than the right side of the face. So when we look at a face, when we're right-handed people, we look at a face, we look more at the left side to, make these judgments of attractiveness, age, expression, and identification too, as you can see here. Well, what's chimeric here means that the way this face, this smiling face, was made is that the right side of this person's face image was actually made from a collection of faces that were not smiling. Okay, they were superimposed on each other. The left side, on the other hand, of this face image was made by a collection of faces of people who were smiling. Okay, so what makes this chimeric is that the left side and right side are different. What makes these especially interesting is that the left side was made from a group of pictures that were, typifying one type of characteristic, in this case, smiling, and the right side was made of one that didn't have that characteristic. And the same thing here. This image here on top was made from a group of people that were younger on the left side and older on the right side. So hopefully, I think this is right, is that lower one looks older than the one on top. Is that right? And gender, the top person looks more masculine than the bottom person, even though they're just reversed. And I think this is made up of images of men. This is made up of images of women. It's the chimeric in that the two halves of the face are made up of different faces, basically, different components in this case. What's important about this whole slide, though, is what is discussed here. We seem more sensitive to the left side of a face from our perspective. It helps determine the age of a person that we perceive, the attractiveness we perceive, the gender expression, and the recognition. And then we talked about why that might be the case. Here's other examples of it. Why? Because of the way the brain is set up, we do seem to have more of a sensitivity for faces on the right side of our brain than on the left side of our brain. And we talked about how the image information kind of crosses the brain here. This is all for right-handed people again. And so the perceptual right hemisphere, as I'm looking at a face, this is where I'm looking mostly, and that's because my right hemisphere is getting information from that side of what I'm seeing, okay? And that's a more sensitive side to faces than my other side. So when I look at the face image, I'm going to look at the side that I have more sensitivity for, and that side's going to determine how I perceive that person's age and attractiveness and masculinity and identity. Okay, so that's really what that's about. Chimeric is just a term for how the stimuli are put together, but it's relevant, so you should know it. Okay, all right. So the right side of our brain is more sensitive, Carla, to faces. That is correct for right-handed individuals. Okay, for left-handed individuals, for people that are ambidextrous, it seems possibly, it's still unclear, but it seems possibly that the face perception function is spread across both hemispheres a little bit more. Okay, don't worry, that's not on your exam. But what is on your exam is the hemispheric difference, and it will say, I believe, on the exam questions that are relevant to this, assume, for right-handed individuals. Okay, because that's more research has been done on that, obviously. All right, yes, so it's the right side of your brain is more sensitive. Okay, more questions. Are there other things?
The right side of your brain is more sensitive to the left side of faces. Is that what you said?
Yeah, okay, I'll put this back up, sorry. Let's just see this. All right, so you're looking down on the brain right now, okay? Can you guys all see this image? Yeah, just put your thumbs up. Okay, good, thank you. Yes, and so imagine that this is Johnny Depp's left side of the face here. This side of his face will get to, because of the fact that I assume you guys learned this at some point, but if you didn't, it's okay. What happens here with the eyes is that the part of the eyes that get the left side of our visual field go to the right side of our brains. Okay, this is probably something you learned in intro, all right? So you can see that that's what's being portrayed here. So Johnny Depp's left side of his face, from our position, the left side of his face is getting to our right hemisphere, and that's what's more sensitive to faces. So we will judge things about Johnny, in fact, recognize him better based on being shown the left side of his face rather than the right side of his face, because the left side of his face goes to the right side of our brain, and that's the side of our brain that's more sensitive to faces. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Okay, more questions. Good. Oh, Paulina, I'm so sorry. I guess you missed it. And it's my fault, Paulina, because I didn't take this slide out. We did not cover personality from faces in our class. We didn't have time for that, sadly. So even though there is a slide on that in the slide set, which I neglected to take out, I'm sorry, we actually did not have time to go over that. So you are certainly not responsible for that. Okay. Okay. Well, the last few slides, okay, so Jessica, okay, so I think people are coming in now late, which is perfectly fine, but I'm going to tell a lot of you folks the same thing. Jessica, I actually did go through the discussion about the last slides, prosopagnosia and functional specialization. Well, functional specialization will be discussed, but those last few slides are actually, no, there's no detail from the last few slides that are on the test. I realized I had to go through them very, very quickly, so they're not. And I did mention that about half an hour ago or so, maybe an hour ago. That's okay, you can come in late. I'm just telling you, this is all being recorded, so if you want more details on that answer, just when this is posted, you can look at the videotape, okay? And I'm also going to tell you, Angelica, the same thing. We did go over the McGurk effect about 45 minutes ago in our discussion in our review session. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and take a look at the recorded video. I'll post it as soon as we're done with this. I'll post it immediately. Rather than going through it again and again, I think that's how we'll handle this. Okay, cool. Okay. Other questions? Go ahead and post them. And you know, if you're worried that I've already answered them, that's fine. I'll just tell you I've answered it, and it'll be on the video. And you know, I took a lot of time answering each of these things with the McGurk effect, so you'll have a lot more information there that you could use for any of these answers. Halo effect, that we have not gone over yet. So yes, let's do that. Okay, so it's a social psychology effect, really. And the reason I discussed it is because I wanted to show how important faces were. So this is really relevant. So what, let me get back here. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So this really is most pertinent to this issue of evolutionary importance, adaptive importance, or ecological relevance. And so what I wanted to say is that there are serious social consequences to faces, right? We like to think of ourselves as you know, being deep, and we are deep, and we don't, you know, just you know, choose spouses and significant others based on their facial attractiveness, but whether we want it to or not, it does have some bearing on our social lives in a number of different ways, suggesting that, yeah, this is one of those dimensions of face perception that shows that there is some kind of important component that has probably some evolutionary importance, and there is. I mean, it's thought that attractiveness, facial attractiveness, does convey things about reproductive fitness, right? So, a younger person, a person with younger facial features, is more likely to be reproductively, fertile than somebody who has older features. We also talked about attractiveness in these contexts. So yeah, whether we like to think of it or not, facial attractiveness does have these social consequences, including things like this halo effect, where parents, teachers, friends, all that, even with little kids, they will spend more time looking, spend more time potentially interacting with children who are considered to have more facial attractiveness than other children. I put this kid up. He's actually adorable, but I also think he's a little funny looking, but still, I'm sure he's adorable in person. But yeah, whether we liked it, I mean, it's true even of children. So they'll also look at each other longer if they have, if the face they're looking at is more attractive. So it does seem to have that sort of thing. Now, what a halo effect means, what's meant by halo here, how angels have those little halos. Yeah, we all know this is Christmas time, right? They have that little ring on their head. The idea is that we attribute positive characteristics. We're more likely to attribute positive characteristics to individuals who have more attractive faces than to individuals who have less attractive faces. So we are assigning them halos. We are assigning them more positive personalities, more kind of, kindness, happiness, virtuousness, all that sort of stuff. And that this happens subliminally, and we can talk about that as well. It's just the real point of this is, again, even though we like to think of ourselves as not judging a book by its cover, as being deeper than this, there are some aspects of this that we just can't. Hey, it's another penetration thing. We can't really penetrate the fact that we can't help but assign positive characteristics to more attractive facial people than less attractive facial people, right? It does also have some bearing. Facial attractiveness has some bearing on professional success. There's people who do social psychology look at these sorts of things. People with more facial attractiveness seem to have better mental and physical health. And again, I don't want anyone to get panicked by this sort of stuff, right? It's not, it's not like this is, all dictating or anything like that. It's just you look at trends and you find people, that have greater facial attractiveness tend to have these things correlated with them. And coupling, and this, this is actually something that is a very well replicated sort of thing where individuals, again, looking at big, data patterns, attractive in people with facial attractiveness and to end up choosing mates that have similar facial attractiveness to themselves. Now, again, I know, I'm a great example of this. My wife's a beautiful woman. I'm goofy looking. I understand. Good thing I'm so rich, right? So there's always going to be deviations from this. But when you look at the big data patterns, you do see correlations in facial attractiveness within coupling. Okay, so that's what this is all about. The halo aspect of it is attributing positive personality characteristics to individuals with more attractive faces. Okay. All right. Let's see what else we got over here. That's halo effect, Carla. Oh, looming perception. Okay, I'm so sorry. But you know what I'm going to do? We still have time. Your test isn't until Monday, or I guess Sunday at midnight. That's another slide, Paulina, that we didn't go over in lecture. So I should pull that out as well. This has been kind of a, we did the best we could this quarter, but it's a little disappointing to me because there's so many great topics I couldn't tell you about because we ran out of time, and that's just because of the remote nature of the lecturing. This is just the way it works. So yeah, sadly, it's another thing I had to cut out of this quarter's class. So I usually do teach it. That's why it's part of the slide set, but I can pull it out of the slide and I will. Okay. All right. Other questions? Oh, that reminds me of something. All right. Biological motion, sure, and structure for motion, absolutely, Carla. So let me stop my sharing and pull that slide up. Okay. Motion perception. Yeah, and sadly, I had to cut some of this out too. So we did start talking about motion perception in general, first in the context of how we are able to detect motion, but then we quickly moved, more quickly than I would have liked to, had to move to this interesting topic of structure from motion. And let's go ahead and show that screen. It's biological motion. So the idea here, we talked a little bit about when we introduced the Gibsonian approach, right? That one of the ways we're able to perceive the third dimension is that when something moves, and especially when people move, or like animal moves, biological motion being the people and the animals, they move in such a way that they give information, they provide information about their form, about their three-dimensional form. So we then, after introducing that concept, and I think at that point we also introduced the idea of being able to see forms based on how points are moving. Do I have this here still? No, maybe this will do it. Oh, shoot. Okay, well, we know that once you see these dots move, once you see the dots down here move, you start seeing forms, you start seeing some three-dimensional forms. So I decided that we should probably talk a little bit more about this because it's such an important part of what our brain does perceptually. And so I talked about the research that's been conducted on our sensitivity to biological motions, especially human motion. So in these experiments, people are asked to look at a screen where they see just a series of dots that are kind of still at first, but then they slowly start to move, and very quickly, as soon as you see the motion, you don't need very much time at all to know that, hey, that's a person, that's two people, that's two people, one a man, one a woman. They're kind of standing, they're dancing, they're doing push-ups, all those sort of things. It's like our brain is really, really sensitive to the type of motion that a person can participate in, so much so that you don't need to see very much about the person at all. In this case, you're only seeing these dots move, right? There's no other kind of person sorts of cues in there. There's, you're not seeing, the texture of their face, their clothing, anything like that. It's just their motion. That's the great thing about these sorts of point light images. They just show motion. But boy, so much, the brain can get so much from just seeing how a person moves, right? It can determine the gender for the most part. It can, that's why I put RuPaul up here because there are exceptions to this, but people are generally able to tell male from female based on the center of gravity. So the physiology is different, and the center of gravity of a woman is lower than that of a man. And you can see a lot more detail than just that. You can see the identity. So if some of your friends had been filmed in this crazy way, you'd be able to recognize them. It might take a little bit. You might have to see them move around a little bit. You say, oh my gosh, there's Rosenblum. I've recognized Rosenblum's silly rocking back and forth anywhere, that type of thing. You can perceive things like the amount of lifted weight. So if you're in that case, you would just basically see the points that are on the hip, the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and you'd be seeing those points move. So what is that? 5 points or something, 4 points. But even seeing those 4 points move, you'd be able to have a sense of how much weight a person is lifting, or whether the weight they're lifting now is more or less than the weight they've lifted before. And you know, you can even see if someone's trying to fool you, if someone pretends they're lifting a heavy weight, right? Like I'm doing now, pretending to lift a heavy weight. You can see through that. You can see that I'm faking just by seeing those points move. You know, if you're a professional mind, maybe you'd fake people out, but very few of us have that sort of skill. You know, our brain is able to get that sort of detail just from seeing these points move. And then we talked about other things like facial expression. We did end up talking about speech last class, how these kind of point light images can be used to convey speech, right? Now you know what that's about. And then when finally we discussed infants being able to detect this type of thing too, and make distinctions based on this, and cats too. You know, if you're a cat person, you might be interested in that. Cats can recognize other cats moving based on seeing point light cats. And I don't know the details of that experiment, but somehow they got things onto cats so they could film them in the dark. And speaking of which, my dog is trying to get on my lap right now. Here, you want to come up? No. All right. Maybe you heard me talking about cats. He got jealous, which is really interesting. It seems like, you know, we're not the only animals that are sensitive to the biological motion of other animals of our species, which is really interesting. And then we talked a little bit about inanimate events. And I think also you did ask in the chat about structure for motion. Right. Okay. So that is basically what I'm talking about. I did mention that, you're able to, these are all in some ways kind of things that we typically would think about as structural characteristics. So that, you know, how, you know, the structure of what distinguishes a man from a woman, you know, the structure that allows us to perceive identity. But maybe the most obvious example of structure for motion is this down here, where you're all of a sudden, I can't get this to actually, I can't get this video to work right now, sorry, but you're able to see that there's a structure of a cube as soon as you see these dots moving in this kind of characteristic way. So you're seeing the motion of the dots, and from that, you can perceive the structure of the objects that are being depicted. Okay, cool. More chat questions. I have to head out, but thank you for answering. Sure, Jessica, my pleasure. Okay, no problem if people have to leave and come back. All this is being videotaped, so you have it. Okay, other questions? Yeah, anything else? Uh-oh. That's my doggy. All right. All right, so let's see. Is this sort of related to those ideas of closure? Yaneli, you're asking if structure from motion is related to closure, and that's an interesting question. Well, first of all, let me be very clear that that is not a question that is on your exam or anything, but it's an interesting question. Is structure from motion something that might be related to closure and laws of organization? Yeah, it's an interesting, I hadn't really thought of it like that, but I imagine if you're a Gestalt psychologist and you're trying to understand how structure from motion works, could that be involved in, I mean, could there be an explanation that has to do with different laws of organization that might help understand how structure from motion works? That's a really good question. I don't know. I should make it clear that it isn't really related to the phi phenomenon. I mean, you know, yes, it's a video, so it's based, you know, any video is going to be based on the phi phenomenon, but I don't think it would typically be considered a phi phenomenon. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't certainly apply the laws of organization to this. That's a good question. I really haven't thought through it. Thank you for asking. Corollary discharge. I think I skipped that, didn't I? Or maybe I didn't. Okay, let's take a look. It's part of this slide group, so that's handy. Yeah, I don't think I talked about it, did I? Could it have been on a previous slide? And I kept that in too. I'm sorry if I did that. I think that was something I had to skip this year because I'm pretty sure these are the exact slides I used in this quarter's lecture, and I don't see it in here. If anyone remembers it in the slide, please let me know. But yeah, it's a little bit complicated. It would have taken about 15 minutes or 10 minutes to explain. I think I skipped it this quarter. So let's assume I skipped it. I don't think there's any question on the test on that. Yeah, I think I did take it out, Selena. Thank you. All right. Other questions? Anything? Okay, well, you can sit there and think, and that's no problem. I'll sit here too. And maybe if you're looking through your notes and something comes up, just go ahead and put it in the chat or speak out loud. Either way is fine. You know, probably people will be coming and going, and so they might have questions as they enter. So it's no problem. Stop sharing the screen at least.
I think you're muted.
I got it. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Uncanny Valley. You betcha. Ellie. And the other one, is that also? Okay, that's co-articulation. It's a different lecture. No problem. Let's go ahead and set this up. So, Uncanny Valley first. And whenever I pull this slide up, it gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't know about you. You know, I guess The Polar Express is still a pretty popular movie. I had no idea. It's on every holiday season. There's I think somewhere either in LA or Riverside, there's a Polar Express kind of winter, Wonderland exhibit or something like that. It's really popular. So, okay. All right. I have trouble watching it. I find it really creepy. And as you can see, here are the characters. That gives me nightmares. But the idea is this, that when you try to render a face to be as realistic as possible, unless you get it perfect, it ends up looking strange. And this is something that's been known for a long, long time, probably about, well, since computer animation and computer animation tried to render human faces, they realized that this was really a very difficult thing to do. And really the point of this, that's relevant to face perception is that there really isn't many things that give you this kind of uncanny valley sort of phenomenon where, you know, something, the more you make it look realistic, the scarier it gets up to a point, right? And that's kind of a demonstration of how sensitive our brains are to faces, right? We can pick out any sort of deviation from a normal human looking face to the point where, you know, it can kind of give us a kind of eerie feeling. So it really, it's a kind of the point of this is that we're extraordinarily sensitive to faces, and it, you know, kind of helped us to get into the issue of special processing for faces and modularity, you know, that cool stuff. But, you know, this is the idea that if you look at this graph, this is a kind of a fun way to understand it. And I like to use C3PO as an example. So this would be a kind of, I guess this would be realism. How real or how close to human is the robot, say, along the x-axis. And this, I think they usually call this how, you know, familiar we feel it is or comfortable we are with looking at the stimulus along the y-axis. And, you know, at first, here's C3PO, and it kind of looks, you know, it looks kind of as a human form, and you say, yeah, that's kind of familiar, I'm comfortable with it. And then we do things like we put a funny wig on C3PO, and it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of cute, it's a little bit closer to human. And, you know, we put a dress on C3PO or some sort of tuxedo or something like that, it's like that's adorable, that doesn't give me the heebie-jeebies, I'm feeling very comfortable with that. And then what we decide to do is put a mask, a rubber mask on C3PO, and then all of a sudden we extremely drop in how comfortable we feel, how familiar it seems to us. All of a sudden it feels like, oh my gosh, that is creepy as anything, right? And that's the valley that we're talking about, where it seems uncanny, it seems like not real, not quite real, and that's enough for us to feel kind of eerie about it, right? One thing I don't know if I said about this, I talk about it in some detail in another class, is that there are theories that the eeriness we get from this, you know, so it's one thing to, you know, be very sensitive to faces and know when they're not real, but why do they feel eerie to us? Why is the emotional reaction eerie? And that's because it's thought that possibly it is, you know, related to the fact that we have evolved to stay away from corpses, to stay away from individuals who are deceased because of the potential, you know, disease, threat, that sort of thing. So yeah, we do find corpses, you know, eerie, scary. We find zombies eerie and scary and all that sort of thing. And that maybe what's going on here with the uncanny valley as it kind of goes into that realm of not being real enough, but being too real to be endearing, right, in that valley, you know, as we look at this, is because it's tapping into that kind of reaction we have to, you know, corpses, things that look like they should be human, but don't really have the right sort of life behind them. And that's, I think, exactly how I would, there's something like these eyes seem dead, or, you know, they're just something where it's not right. I don't see the soul there or something like that. And that's why it seems eerie. Okay, so that's the uncanny valley story. Really, I used it as an introduction to faces. And how sensitive the brain seems to be about faces, and it's so sensitive that you know, it's something that computer animation folks have been working against for decades now. And they've, you know, in my other class, I talk about a little bit more about the history of that in film, but I don't need to go into that now here, as long as you get the idea of how it fits in the big discussion. Okay. The next question had to do with co-articulation. Absolutely, Carla. Let's quit this slide and go back to our speech perception slide. Yes. That was before this. So the idea in co-articulation is that basically it suggests that when we are, comes before this. Yeah, okay, there it is. So here's the slide on co-articulation. For those of you that weren't here in the beginning of our review session, I did talk a little bit about what formants are and then their relevance to the story that I was telling about designing a speech recognition device and why it's been so difficult. You can go back and look at that on this video. What we discussed was the fact that these, what we thought might be critical cues, the kind of important features for speech recognition were actually dependent on the vowel context that the consonant that we're trying to recognize is in. So say, okay, I'm going to design this machine now. I'm going to design Siri. Well, okay, before Siri, proto-Siri, early Siri. I'm going to try to design this Siri to recognize the duh sound, right? We know that we can recognize letters D by using the feature analysis that's implemented in the post office. This is looking at the scanning the envelopes and finding the letter D. It does a good job. So we can do the same thing with the sounds of speech. And you try to teach it, okay, computer, that's going to be Siri. Look for one of these little transitions. These are called formant transitions. Go back and look at that on the video if you need to, and say, okay, whenever you see one of these kind of downward sliding little transition thingies, you know you're seeing or you're hearing a D, right? This is the sound. This is how the sound of D looks when you kind of plot it out on those graphs we looked at earlier, right? We just remember all these. And so it will allow you to distinguish a D from a B and a G potentially, right? We talked about all that. But here's the problem. This transition isn't going to work all the time. In fact, once you put the D sound in a context of E rather than U, okay, it no longer is the critical feature. The critical feature becomes this. So what distinguishes D in the context of a vowel E. So when I mean in the context, when the vowel's following the consonant D, when I say D, that context, what distinguishes D from G and B is now a rising transition. So it's a mess. The critical features, what we could think of as kind of something analogous to the lines, the kind of curves, the angled lines, the vertical lines on the page in sound don't seem to be that consistent. In fact, they're not consistent at all. The features, the formants change with the vowel context. The formants and their transitions change with the context. And the question is, why does that happen? And it happens because unlike text, unlike written letters, the sounds of speech, the phonemes are all smushed together, right? And that's why I had you kind of produce down here D versus do to yourself, right? So when I go D, do, I can certainly feel that there's a difference in what happens with my lips, but that difference in what happens in my lips actually starts before I'm producing the vowel. So here I go, I'm going to start producing D, but I'm not going to produce the vowel. I'm only going to produce the D sound, but I'll plan on producing D. So it's D. See, as you can see, my lips are already anticipating the E sound. And the same thing happens with do. D. So I'm stopping before I get to the U, but my lips are already anticipating the production of that vowel. And that's what co-articulation is. Co-articulation suggests that we are actually producing more than one phoneme at a time. We are co-articulating. As I'm producing duh, I'm actually already starting to produce the E. When I produce the duh for do, I'm also actually already starting to produce the U. We overlap our consonants and our vowels when we produce them. Okay, that's what co-articulation is. We overlap the articulation of the phonemes as we're producing them. And so that kind of smushes things together. And smushing together the phonemes, just like articulation does, makes the features much more difficult to find. Okay, does that help? Let's see. Yeah, yes, good. Great, Carla. Okay, more questions. Categorical perception, absolutely, Paulina. That's right up here. So after our discussion about how difficult it's been to design a machine and why it's been, I mean, you know, it's taken so long to design a machine to recognize speech consistently. And even now Siri does some comically bad mistakes, as we know. How do people do it? I mean, how does the brain do it? And if the brain has to work so hard to do it, is that maybe something that again suggests there's something modular about speech perception, right? And so that's kind of how we started, speech special. And so what we did is we went through modularity again, and then we talked about some of the characteristics of speech that might support modularity, right? But then what we concentrated on was this idea of functional distinctness. Is there something different about the processes of speech perception that distinguish it from non-speech sounds, right? So when we get speech sounds coming into our brain, do we use kind of a different set of operations than we would use for other sounds, like the sounds of musical instruments, the sounds of basketballs bouncing, the sounds of doors closing? Maybe that's done, you know, by a general region of the brain, but when it comes to speech, it's so important. It's so critical to our survival, and it takes such work because of this featural problem with the, you know, messy overlap of the co-articulation. Maybe we use special processes. So that's what we then did. We looked for evidence of special sorts of processes that might be occurring for speech versus non-speech stimuli. Okay. So that's where categorical perception came in. And what categorical perception is all about is the fact that even if you make a continuous smooth change in a stimulus, in a speech stimulus, right, that it isn't perceived as a continuous smooth change, right? It's not, it's perceived that way. And so we had the example, I'm not going to play it again, it's on the lecture video, that I made this great example, if I can say so myself, this great example of my speech being slowly changed acoustically from say to stay. And I did that by adding a little bit more silence as I was going across, I think 9 different stimuli, 9 different tokens of say and stay. And even though I changed it a little bit at a time, what people perceive is not a slow, continuous change, but no change for a while, and then all of a sudden, a very abrupt change where it changes from say to stay. So despite the continual change in the stimulus, okay, going slowly from say to stay, what we perceive is categorical, meaning that we perceive nothing but says, and actually all those says sound the same to us. You know, if you're asked to distinguish between them, to discriminate between them, you have a hard time. I don't think these all sound the same here. I can't tell which is which. But once you get to that category boundary, all of a sudden it abruptly changes to stay. Okay. And then once we're in the stay category, all those stays sound the same. So it's as if the brain is superimposing categories onto a continuously changing group of stimuli. Okay. And that's what categorical perception is about. And we talked about the fact that that really might be, you know, specific to speech. So, well, I don't have an amplifier for this guitar. It's electric, this one. So yeah, I carry guitar wherever I go, right? You know, I think you probably can hear this if I slowly go up. Well, maybe it's hard to hear, but you get the idea that when you go up a guitar string, it sounds like it's going up continuously, right? That's a type of stimulus that we perceive continuously. However, for speech, when you make a continuous change, we don't hear it kind of continuously changing. We hear it categorically changing. And that might be special to speech. And I won't go through all these details. But yeah, it's not worth going through all these details. You can look back at it. But really, we're using that as an example of evidence for a type of processing that might really be specific to speech and not applied to non-speech sounds, supporting the idea potentially that there's a speech module that uses special operations. Okay, so that's what categorical perception was all about. All right. More questions? I'm doing the time. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna shift locations here. Actually, you won't know that because I have a virtual background. Looks funny when people do this, doesn't it? So I'm walking, but the background walks with me. Okay. Let me know when you have more questions. Oh, good. Okay, Paulina, I did go over cues versus information. Okay, and that was something we did kind of towards the beginning of the review session. So that will be on the recording of the review session. Oh, okay. Everyone's saying thank you. That's my pleasure. Good luck on your tests, everybody. I'm just going to be modifying the slides here so people don't get confused about the slide material I didn't cover, but I'll keep looking back to see if anyone has questions. No problem. Okay, so let's see. Last question. Sorry, can you go over? Oh, sure. Okay. Object versus object. My pleasure, Carla. Let's go ahead and see where that information is. So this story with object and object was, oh, sorry, hold on a second. Let me Just take a second. So again, this is relevant to this discussion of whether speech is perceived with specialized processes that make it distinct from how other sounds are processed. And this is something we discussed right after categorical perception, in fact. And the idea was this, that when it comes to most of the sounds that we encounter, like, as I said, basketball sounds, musical sounds, sounds you might create in a laboratory using a computer, scientists are good at predicting how loud they will seem to a person. You can measure the energy, you can measure the energy of the sound, the energy of a whistle, the energy of a noise, anything really, and make predictions about how loud a person's going to say that the sound is. However, when it comes to speech, it isn't that simple. When it comes to speech, you really can't predict how loud a person will say a sound is based on the amount of acoustic energy. Remember, you learned this in your discussion section, that amplitude of the signal, the amplitude of the energy corresponds more or less to how loud a sound will seem. Other things come into play, but it's pretty easy for scientists to make that prediction. When it comes to speech, though, it ain't like that. And so I kind of tried to give a very, very kind of clear example of that, where I made the E and the ah sound so that I recorded them so they sounded pretty much the same to people, I think. The E and the ah were equally loud. But then when you look at the amount of energy, ah has so much more energy than E. And so then I went ahead and I then, tried to increase the E so it had as much energy as the ah, whether I increased it using, just having the computer program increase the energy of the recordings. And then the E sounded louder than the I, even though they had equal energy, more or less, or comparable energy. And then what I did is that silly example where I tried to actually produce an E myself while looking at a little sound level meter so that the E had the same amount of energy as I. And I did a pretty good job in terms of the amount of energy, but boy, you listen to that one, it just sounds like the E is so much louder. And so the question is, why does your brain, as you listen to speech, not really depend on the amount of acoustic energy to perceive the loudness of a speech sound? Why does the loudness of a speech sound why is it not predicted by the amount of energy like it is for all other sounds? And we thought, well, let's first think about the quick function of that. And maybe this is where the object-object thing comes in, right? So it might help us hear stress in syllables, like object versus object. In object, the first syllable is stressed. In object, the second syllable is stressed, right? And if I asked you then, well, what do you hear when you hear a stressed syllable? And you say, well, I guess I say the stressed syllable sounds louder to me. Object, yeah, I say the first one sounds louder, and an object, the second one sounds louder. So yeah, I would say that loudness might be the kind of, the sensory sort of experience that I might link up with syllable stress. Okay, but the truth is, like the E's and Ahs, it's not that simple. So for object and object, you can see the amount of energy is greater. Energy, again, is the kind of extent along this axis here. The amount of energy is greater for the first syllable in both cases, okay? So even if for object, there's more energy for that first syllable than there is for the second syllable. And so one function of this idea that speech loudness might not correspond to the amount of energy is it might allow us, in fact, to perceive syllabic stress in syllables this way, right? So in both cases, the ah is more acoustically intense. It has more energy than the ject part, but you don't hear it that way. You don't hear the loudness that way. What you hear the loudness as being based on is something very different. It is the amount of effort, the amount of work that went on during the syllable's production by the speaker. And how do we know that? Well, you can measure that. You can measure the amount of work by taking the pressure, the amount of air pressure below the voice box, as well as how fast the air goes across the voice box when it's released. and taking in those characteristics of the speech production act, right, will allow you to determine something that the scientists called vocal work. And that is the thing that best predicts how loud a speech sound will seem to a listener. So it's as if, and this was kind of the interesting part of this, is as if when we're listening to speech, especially when it comes to loudness or syllable stress, we're kind of ignoring in some ways the kind of acoustic dimensions of the degree of energy, and instead listening to how the speech is produced. Okay, and that's why I said here, we hear articulation, we hear kind of the event parameters, the event characteristics behind the sound, right? What I mean here by event is the articulation event behind the sound. And that's really what's determining things like syllable stress and loudness of speech. And that idea of perceiving something that's behind the sound, kind of ignoring this kind of superficial aspects of the sound and really listening to the important things behind the sound, might be special to speech. And if that's the case, that might be more evidence for this kind of modularity, that speech perception is so special, right? Its processes are so special that that when we listen to speech, we kind of ignore aspects of the sound that we don't ignore for other types of sounds, and listen for, you know, what's making the sound. In this case, it would be the articulation of the sound behind the speech. Okay, so that's where the object-object story comes in. All right. How are we doing? I have maybe a question, time for one more question. I've got to leave in 2 minutes, but I will be posting the entire review session, so you'll be able to see the earlier questions too if you came in late. Okay, thank you. Great. I'm glad you feel more confident, Polina. Anything else? Okay, good luck on your tests, everybody. I'll be posting the video just a little bit.